Welcome to the Fintech Founder Journey, the podcast that explores fintech and the founders that power it. We look at how to build great fintech products, great fintech businesses, and how to work on yourself to be great at what you do. I'm your host, Mike Scott, and I'm also the co-founder and CEO of Nona Digital, an expert firm that consults on, designs, and develops software for fintech companies around the world. In today's show, Nona's CTO, Dave O'Reilly, joins me again, and this time we'll be talking about why it is so difficult to estimate costs and timelines for software development projects. Today's podcast is sponsored by ourselves, Nona Digital. We are an expert firm that consults on, designs, and develops fintech software, and we do it with a level of care and excellence that is rare and difficult to match. Working with us, you get access to a deeply skilled and experienced fintech design and development team with a particularly deep experience level in blockchain. You get the benefit of a team that is big enough for no key person dependencies to exist, but small enough so that you're always close to the principles. You get the benefit of our reusable component library, which means we are able to launch your fintech product sooner than anyone else could at a comparable standard. To get in touch with one of our principals, to see how we could help your fintech project to accelerate and succeed, head over to nona.digital to book a consultation directly. And now onto the show. Welcome, Dave. It's good to have you back. We had you last in May, I think. What's been happening since then?
Hey, Mike. Yes, it's great to be back. Absolutely nothing has been happening because it's Corona. It's the most boring apocalypse. So yeah, very little. Work's been good though, so that's nice.
So for the listeners, Dave is a tinkerer and a fan of BMW vehicles, a passion that we do not share by any stretch of imagination. And Dave has been modifying the hell out of his BMW. So Dave, in 30 seconds, tell us what you've been doing to your poor car.
I think that's giving it much too much credit. I'm just trying to understand the basics. But current project is I'm just doing a bunch of what people in cars, for whatever reason, call coding. There's probably a good reason for that. So I've just kind of been changing some things, like getting it not to complain at me if I don't wear my seatbelt and things of this nature. Current thing is you can replace the firmware and the automatic transmission to make it shift nicer. So that's what I'm going to be doing.
This is a bit of an of an inside joke. At our daily huddle every single day, everyone speaks about Nona, but David speaks about his BMW. Anyway, onto the show. So to frame today's conversation, software is expensive to build and it's difficult to estimate. Almost every instance, you are building something that has never been built before. It is almost by definition unique and bespoke, not always, but usually. And there is usually a bit of tension between the client or the product manager or whoever's on the sort of, let's call it the other side, and the people building the software, between not being able to commit to hard and fast costs, deadlines, whatever you want to call it. So we thought we would dig in a little bit and just sort of try and demystify this whole thing instead of just sort of this dark art of, well, it'll take as long as it takes, to actually maybe explore this a little bit. And Dave has worked on tons and tons of projects over his career around the world. So we'll try and get into a sort of demystifying conversation. So Dave, just to begin with, to sort of set this in a simple way and so that we're aligned, what do we actually mean when we're saying a software project? Just so we're on the same page, what are we talking about when I say it's difficult to estimate the size or the cost of a software project?
It's a good question. I don't know that there's a super obvious answer to it. I would just say a software project would be like some piece of functionality delivered by software, right? I suppose in a very developer-centric way, I'm going to say you could conceptualize of any project as being composed of sub-projects and so on ad infinitum, right? So at any given scale, some value enabled by software, which implies some functionality executed by the software in some kind of way that you broadly know what you want it to do, right? And how defined that is up front, I guess, is one of the things we'll talk about a lot, I imagine, in this particular episode.
Cool. So what I'm going to take from that is we're not talking about an entire product we're talking about a feature or a set of features or an entire product, but it's really just a deliverable that is built with software, right? So just to set the tone for the users, the listeners, we're not talking about a complete product. It literally might be one feature. It kind of falls into the same thing. Okay, so let's just get straight into it. So, we are a services business, which means we build stuff for other people. So we are continuously having the conversation of, okay, guys, who needs to be on this project? How long does it need to take? What's the velocity going to be? And ultimately the client says, great, what's that going to cost me? And we can never really answer that question. So the typical questions we get starting off with is very simply, okay, guys, I've checked you out. I've had some references. I've looked at your work. You look great. How much is it going to cost me to build this thing? When we hear that, Dave, what is your first response to that?
I guess response. So it's going to depend. It's going to depend on what the thing is, right? Because depending on how conventional or unconventional that thing is, and then also obviously intersecting with how much experience we have specifically in that thing, it's going to be a different answer, right? Because on the one extreme, someone can ask you for something that you have done so many times before that it's practically productized. It's very by the numbers. You know exactly what they want. So it's not really something that we would do per se, but I think the classic example of that in software would be if someone's like, hey, I want a WordPress site. I don't need any plugins in it. I just need it set up with some themes or whatever, right? Because that is super defined. On the other side of it would be someone who says, I have this idea about attributing ownership on the blockchain in a particular industry, but there might be a bunch of partners we can work with, but also I'm not sure if I should use a blockchain, right? So those kind of would be two pretty good illustrations of the one you could give another answer to. The other one, my response would generally be, cool, well, we're going to need to do some introductory meetings, a bit of consulting, and then probably go through a discovery process before we could really say what something like this is going to cost. And
okay, but let me jump in there. But let me jump in there. I want to dig in a little bit. So in our case anyway, most of our clients will enter through strategy consultation. A lot of our clients, especially if it's early on or a new product within a business, will do some discovery work. And one of the outputs of those engagements is a technical specification, right? Or a roadmap or a product document saying this is what we want to build, this is what we can build, etc. But even at that stage, it's difficult to give an exact costing. Why is that? So we've done the work, we've looked at it, we've done the technical feasibility, but even then, once we really understand the product and the outcomes and the stakeholders and the APIs that we're going to use, and we understand all of the stuff, we still are saying to them, and every software development company is saying, okay, we still can't give you an accurate proposal. Here is a range of costing. It could cost, we think, minimum this much. We hope maximum that much, but it's a range. Why is it still so difficult to give an accurate costing at that point?
Yeah, so there's many reasons. Many reasons. So I guess I'll speak about a few of them, and they kind of come in different categories. So the one sort of classic reason would just be that planning is intrinsically difficult. That's not unique to software. Let me just preface it by saying none of this is an excuse for poor planning or poor communication or anything like that. I want to be quite clear about that. These are all just inputs into like how you should plan and how you should communicate about it, right? But planning is notoriously difficult. People are notoriously bad at planning. There's a ton of studies about this. I'm not really going to recap them. There's a ton of famous military and construction projects, etc., that all have immensely impressive budget and time overruns, all that kind of thing. But so I suppose a few things is that one is that people, we tend to be quite bad at considering unusual circumstances, right? This is how I think of it. My kind of overall framing is that people tend to look at everything and they assume that nothing unusual will happen. Right? They just go, well, this is how many days each bit of this should take. And that's never the case. Like, unusual things always happen. And also, because they're unusual, unless you're kind of some kind of career statistician that also lives the work or whatever, then you're not really going to be factoring that in. So that's on a broad level. On a software level, there's a few specific things that happen. Like, the one is that with software, very often the tools that you use are frequently changing, right? So a classic example is that you're a few months into something and then you need a particular feature of a framework you're using. But then find out that this framework has a newer version that has this feature, not the current version that you started the project with, right? Because things can move quite quickly. So cool. So you need to upgrade the framework. That takes some amount of time. Maybe it's super painless. Maybe there's some strange bug introduced by the new version. But now, having done that, then you find out that, well, some of the dependencies that you were using now need to be updated because they're now incompatible with the framework. And then maybe you discover that your one dependency was giving you a feature for free. Like, I don't know, a real world example. Maybe you had a very easy way of optimizing images, and optimized images on a website are important because they let Google give you a good page rank. And now that you've updated your dependency, now it turns out that image optimization doesn't work anymore because it wants a different version of a library, and that library has dropped that feature for some reason, etc., etc. And all of that can be quite difficult to predict because until you're fully in the weeds of it, you're not going to know. By the time you've looked at something in enough detail to know every single low-level granular feature you're going to want from a framework, you're a long way to actually having built it, right? Which is, I think, a common theme in a lot of the stuff.
So let me jump in there, Dave. So that's interesting. So it's almost, and in the prep for this, I saw some notes of yours, and something jumped out at me there. It begs the question, how much money and time do you want to spend up front investigating this before you start building? Right? Because if you go super deep into the investigation, like you said, you might be able to get to a very clear specification. But by the time you've done that, you've actually spent so much time and so much money that have you actually gained anything? So talk to me about that sort of delicate balance of, like, you know, how much time do you spend investigating and planning versus actually building? And again, I don't think it's a science. It's probably a bit of an art, or maybe a bit of both. But how do you think about that? Because I'm sure many founders listening to this or thinking about this are going, you know, I've got investors. I can't just write a blank check. If you give me a range within 5%, sure, that's easy. But if you give me a range within 50% or 100% of the budget, how the hell do I work with that? So talk to me about how you think about that.
Yeah. So software has, I was going to say unique, but maybe it's not entirely unique, but it's certainly a big factor that's fairly unique, if that's a valid thing to say, which is that sufficiently planned software is the end product, right? Where it's completely distinct from stuff in the physical world, because no matter how well you plan a bridge or a power plant or a jet fighter, you still, once you have the absolutely perfect blueprint of this thing, you still have to actually go build it in real life. Whereas with software, a perfect blueprint specifying every detail of what it does is in fact the software project itself, right? Which is quite a unique and interesting quality.
Hold on, that's interesting. I've never thought of that before. That's really interesting. Let me just make sure I understand that. So when you're building a fighter jet or a power plant or a bridge, you can plan to the minutiae and then you build the thing. But what I heard you say was when you're building a software project, the deliverable, the product itself is that perfect blueprint. That's really interesting. I've never heard that.
Because, you know, at the end of the day, it's the code. The specification of every last thing that the software should do is only realizable in the actual software product itself, and then it exists. So
okay, but I think I think this is actually interesting for me. I didn't expect to actually go down this channel, but this is really interesting for me. And so that then would, I guess, speak to why it's so difficult to estimate, because you're only going to have the perfect blueprint once you've built the software. You actually can't have that blueprint until you've built the software. So if you're trying to make these estimates about what the blueprint is going to look like before you've actually got the knowledge to know that, kind of by definition, there's an element of guessing. Is that what am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, exactly. Because it's like a perfect estimate is a completed product, and a completed product is also a perfect estimate retrospectively. And so that's one of the things that I think Agile is kind of about, is this idea of, because these lines are so blurry, as you start building the project, if you're doing things in an Agile way, the idea is not that you never ever know. It's not like, oh, you're 1 year into an Agile project, how much time is left? Who knows? Which I think is commonly misapprehended. It's more like the further you go with an Agile project, the more accurate your estimation should be getting. That's part of the thing, and that's also because of that quality that software has, right?
Right. So I know Ed, our COO, and your brother David, I know that he likes to say, trying to estimate accurately at the beginning of a project, what you're actually doing is trying to make the biggest decisions about a project at the point at which you know the least about it.
Yeah,
and that's kind of what you're saying as well, is that as you progress,
surprise, I agree with him on this. Yes,
and it kind of goes. I'm going to say something that's going to sound really stupid, but it's kind of like the point at which you can give an accurate estimation is once you finish the project, which of course is a useless thing. But that's kind of what I'm hearing from you, is like, oh, we can tell you exactly how long it will take once it's finished.
If I was going to hop in on that, I'd say like, well, there's a bit of an art to being sure that you've actually finished the project, though. So that's kind of interesting in and of itself.
Definition of done, right? Definition of done is very different to many different people. Cool. So that's super interesting, but I do want to move on and not get too deep into that, because I feel like we could speak about that for an hour. So moving on to sort of put the language from the founder's perspective, building software. Very often a founder has got investors, and if they don't have investors, they're using their own money, and it's very rare that it's just a bottomless pit of funding. So there's this tension that exists of going, okay, guys, I understand Agile methodology, I understand time and materials, I understand this estimation process, but I need to know like a worst case scenario. I need to know, if you've told me it's going to cost $500,000, I can work with that. But if you tell me it's going to cost anywhere from $300,000 to $2 million, that's like telling me nothing, right? And just to be clear, I mean, we don't give that level of a range, but how do you respond to that when a founder says, okay, look, you're giving me a range of within 15%, but that's too much, or you've given me a range of within 30%, but that's too much. I need a range within 5%. What's your response to that?
Well, I guess it depends how diplomatic I'm being. But cool. So look, if someone goes, this range is too big and I can't work with it, then okay, the real world response would be, you can sort of pick a response. You can either say, which is true, okay, cool, forget the range. It's the top end then. That's what it is. If you want something, you can put a flag in the ground. You know what I mean? It's going to be cool. Then to your example, which again, we don't actually have such a big range, then I'd just be like, cool, if you need to take something to the bank, take 2 million to the bank. And I suppose with that, I almost think of that as having a different hat on, if that makes sense, because we're doing strategic stuff and we're also doing implementation, right? It's like you're sort of playing a dual role, because on the implementation side, as it were, you've created this estimate. But on the strategy side, I'm going to advise that person. I'm going to say, cool, this estimate you have from your vendor, you have got to plan for the absolute high end of that estimate, which is sort of me with a different hat on, right? Because it's a failure state that's very common, is that people get, and actually this is sort of interesting, you can kind of see this all the way up the chain, especially with less experienced teams, where a project manager, depending on how your teams are structured, let's assume you have a PM or whatever, and the project manager will ask the developers for an estimate for a whole project or feature. And so often the developers will actually come back with a fairly realistic estimate that the project manager will immediately think, oh, that's too long, And so they will then take the middle range estimate up the chain and so on and so forth, all the way to a vendor saying to the client, oh, well, this is the range. And the client immediately in their own mind going, okay, well, I'm just going to see you in the middle. And like, strategically, that's just a bad idea because the ranges are real, right? A, and B, we know that people are bad at planning. So maybe you're working with the magical vendor, the classic things of all psychology studies and stuff. Maybe you're working with the 1% of people who just not like the other people, but what are the chances, right? How many dice rolls do you want to take on this kind of thing? So you should probably assume the top end.
So this is difficult shit, right? This is difficult to estimate. We are bad at estimating as humans. There are countless examples. You can Google them about like exercises you can do yourself to actually see how bad you are at estimating how long things cost. There's deck of card exercises, etc. But bringing this into sort of a practical sense, Dave, and I don't even know if you can answer this because you sit on the sort of other side of the fence, but you have a lot of exposure to this. The founder that's listening to this, that is building software or wants to build software, and is frustrated by the lack of clarity in a software estimation, what advice can you give them in terms of how they might approach this better, or if not better, just in your language that you used to say, like real talk? So I'm kind of asking you to shift a little bit from the builder expert mindset into kind of like the founder mindset and saying, okay, so I've heard this, I keep getting the same thing from every software company I hear, they keep giving me these massive ranges, I'm getting really frustrated. As a friend sitting there, not as someone trying to sell to them, what's your advice to them in terms of how best to approach this?
Yeah, it's a really good question that I don't know if I have a pat answer to, but okay. So I would say the first thing I would say is, all right, if you're getting these enormous ranges, ask the people to quantify, like, why is the range so big? Like, what exactly is it that you're uncertain about, right? So basically, you shouldn't be getting, as much as the final estimate comes to a range, there should still be a breakdown within that. Like, be like, what stuff is uncertain? And you can ask them, what would it take to bring the uncertainty down on this? Depending on the vendor you're working with, though, you've got to be careful not to accidentally bully them into pretending that they're more sure than they are about this just to win your business, right? Again, it's like real world. You've got to be aware that if that company really wants your business, and they may be incentivized the more you question this, not to push back and just to say, oh yes, well, look at that, we've really quantified this now. We wouldn't. I think a lot of people who've been in the industry longer wouldn't, but you should be aware as a founder that this is a thing that can happen with vendors, it can happen with your developers, so be careful of that. But yeah, I would say quantify the bits, and then just be as I've said, I think before in this podcast, be super ruthless about like, okay, but what do we really actually need? What bits are contributing the uncertainty here? And obviously, uncertainty is additive over time, right? And well, maybe that's not obvious. Uncertainty is additive over time. The longer a project is overall, the bigger your range of uncertainty is. So that's why MVP thinking can be incredibly helpful and go, okay, but can I get this down to something where the best case scenario is 3 months? Because then the worst case scenario is 6 months, instead of the best case scenario being 8 months and the worst case scenario is 2 years, right? So like the more you can drill in on like, what is my smallest piece of functionality that will actually generate value, that's good. And like try aim for that horizon, and be aware that the further out you plan, the fuzzier everything gets. One reason it's obvious is that like it's obvious that like it's additive, right? The other thing is that deadline slipping is non-linear, not in the direction you want it to be, right? I think, I'm trying to remember who's got a good example of this. I think it's in Anti-Fragile, which has obviously been quoted to death by everyone, but he gives the example of traffic, which I think is quite a good analogy, right? It's like if you're planning to get to the airport, you need to allow for the fact that you can have a very dramatic bad incident in traffic. It can get so much worse, but it can only get very slightly better. And the same is true with project planning by an experienced team. Things can still get so much worse because it can turn out that, let's try out some more examples. You're building on a platform, you're using a bunch of APIs. Unless you've used every single one of those APIs before, there could be lurking weirdness with any one of them. Like real world examples. I always think real world examples are useful for people who maybe, don't do this daily. So say you're using AWS or Google Cloud or whatever, you're going to use a bunch of services. Perhaps your team has used all of them before, but if they haven't, no one's perfect. And so it's always possible to run into, for example, an unpredicted performance situation. Maybe you're using a database solution or something and you've read all the metrics and you're like, no, we can totally do whatever we need. We need to be able to do 10,000 reads a minute and this will be fine. But it turns out that nobody before you had ever tried to do 10,000 reads where you were reading, I don't know, like 4 different kinds of objects. And it turns out that in that exact circumstance that nobody has ever written a blog post about, that it just so happens that your application needs to do, suddenly the performance of this database is now at 10% of what you thought it would be. And you can't get 10 times the capacity because that would be prohibitively expensive. So now you have to totally redesign that bit of your data model. And there was no way to see that coming without actually executing that, right? That's a pretty good real world example. Another real world example is the more, say, crypto stuff's a good example, right? This is a thing that's constantly in flux. So maybe you're using a company that provides information to you about different blockchains, right? And perhaps as only when you get into it do you discover that although their documentation said that they support a specific API call on a specific blockchain, actually they don't. And when you mail their customer support, they're like, oh yeah, oops, sorry, we don't. And now that's a problem you've got to solve. Maybe you've got to run your own server. And these are not, my point is you cannot know these things until you hit them. These are why I think they're good examples.
And in fintech, and in fintech specifically, fintech, as we know, is built on APIs. It's kind of like the movement of APIs. So the examples you've given there are really, really apt because most of the founders we're speaking to, most of them, not all of them, certainly not all of them, but most of them are basically putting together a very, very strong user experience based on a different costing model or a different algorithm or a different route to market, but they're effectively harnessing a whole bunch of existing APIs. So, every now and then it's different, and we have a client or we work with somebody who's actually creating one of those APIs to serve the market. But to your point, the requirements on these APIs, particularly in the fintech space, is changing all the time. It's growing, it's morphing, etc. So just because it's an established and well-known API, and I won't mention any names, doesn't mean it can do everything that every app could possibly want it to do. So I think it's a very good point that you raised. Dave, I want to shift to something now. We're doing something a little different today. Before this episode, I sent out a little LinkedIn blast around the fact that we're going to be talking about this topic. And I just asked, I did this like 2 hours before we started recording, and I've got 2,500 views on that question already, which means there's obviously we've hit a bit of a thread here. But I just asked if anyone has any questions that they want us to drill down into. So I won't go through all of them, but I'm going to pick 2 of them. So the first one I'm going to pick is from a gentleman named Oz. And he gave a lot of context, but effectively the question here is a range estimate of time and inherently costs if charging per hour a fair approach to quote for a product or feature? And in which cases? Did you get that question, Dave, or should I read it again?
Yeah, no. I think I get it. I mean, okay, so I think an interesting thing there is the word fair, right? Like, as a vendor, I mean, yes, like no one wants to be a dick, but I think your concern is more like what the market is okay with, right? Like what people, I suppose maybe I'm being too nerdy about this, but it's not really about fair at all. It's about what other people think is fair or can understand is fair, right? Like
some market related basically, because you're describing a market.
Will people think this is reasonable? I guess is maybe how I would think of it. So And again, I guess I'm going to nitpick one more thing. If you're giving a range and you say that if the range is exceeded, then it's on you, that's cool, but the lower part is completely inconsequential. You're just giving a maximum cost. The fact that it's a range doesn't matter. You're actually just going like, this is the max cost and that's where it's capped, right? So again, it sort of goes to that point that if you're planning in real terms, you've just got to look at the maximum cost. Like the range is informational, but the range has no bearing on the fairness because it's either going to hit the max cost or it's going to be under the max cost, right? The range is only information. It's not actually relevant to the fairness. So, okay, that said, so for us, I can just talk, I think, about what we do, because obviously everyone struggles with this question. We look at it as a question of risk transfer, right? In the sense that, so if you do an honest estimate upfront and you give your client that estimate, right? Like you've basically said, here's the estimate. However, should you engage with us in a purely agile way on time and materials, ultimately the risk of overrun is being borne by you, right? Because the longer it goes, the more they pay. And then obviously that's a question of reputation. If someone thinks that your word is good on the estimate, and you obviously, as you have something riding on the line, because if you get known for constantly giving low estimates and then going over them, well, that's also bad for you. But reputational risk is one thing. Dollar risk is a completely different thing. So I think most people would agree that while the reputational risk is real, the real risk here is sitting with the client. They're the ones who are on the hook if it's like, oh, sorry, we said 6 months, looks like it's 12 months. Then the other side, traditionally, is obviously fixed cost. And so the way I think of fixed cost is that it's a risk transfer. And to zoom in on that, to my way of thinking, and look, maybe people will disagree with this, and I'm always interested. So if you do, please comment or whatever, send me a message. I've come to think of a fixed cost business as you're actually running two separate companies in a sense, although they're related, because you're now running an implementation company that's going to take as long as it's going to take, right? You're also running an insurance company because you are selling insurance on how long that job is going to take. And to do that, you're estimating the likelihood of an overrun, and you're ultimately putting your money on the line. And the other reason I analogize it to insurance is the principle of insurance is the same. The higher your premium you're charging is that the market will bear, and the more stuff comes in under that premium, the more money you've made, right? As an insurer, that's how you make money. And so that's why I view fixed cost as doing that, because if we've got an estimate and someone wants to do a fixed cost, then the calculation is like, how much money are we willing, how much is that risk worth to us? If you want to be insured against that risk, right? We're going to take that off you, and then you need to pay us to take that risk off you. And now we've taken that gamble. Essentially, we've bought your risk. You could have gone to a third-party insurer if such a thing existed and said, hey, Nona's giving me this estimate. What would you charge me for a policy where you agree to pay the job to completion? It's the same thing. So that's how I've come to view it. And we give clients actually both of these options. We say, look, here's the estimates, our honest estimate with all the caveats that entails, like our reputation, etc. Alternatively, you can go to a fixed cost model, which is going to be priced at significantly more than the estimate, because now we are doing a risk transfer. So we actually give people both of those options because different things might work for different clients. Is that
absolutely
a final form of what we're doing? Who knows?
And I think that's also critical, is that different things do work for different clients. That's very, very important to just stress that, is that not every model is right for every client. So we'll do one more question. I'm going to pick the next question. This one should be a little bit quicker because I'm conscious of time. So the next one is from Louis, who is a friend of Nona. We know Louis well. So the question is, does Sprint Zero give you a fair reflection or indicative roadmap to costs from the development team's perspective? Did you get that, Dave, or should I read it again?
Yeah, no, I've got that. I think so from my point of view, no, but I'm conscious, like many terms, especially in Agile, these terms are quite overloaded and they might mean things for different people. So in my opinion, Sprint Zero is not about estimation per se. You may get some narrowing down of your estimation as like a side effect, but Sprint Zero is primarily about technical setup and planning. So for us, Sprint Zero is not really where estimates get particularly refined down, except as a side effect of technical choices being investigated, right? We're not going to say to the devs, hey, a deliverable from Sprint Zero is a more refined estimate, because that's kind of putting the focus on the wrong thing. Sprint Zero for us is about build setup, documentation, more granular tech choice investigation, because ideally in our process, some of the larger decisions have to some extent been investigated, although potentially not decided, and might only be decided further down the line as well. So it's kind of investigation, technical setup, documentation setup, the team figuring out the structure that's going to work for them. Also, always investigating some new tools, because in each project you might want to try out some new things. That's the kind of stuff that happens. Also, I'll speak to the word costs there. So roadmap to costs from the dev team perspective, I don't believe that the dev team in Agile is thinking about costs at all, generally speaking. And if you have the fortune or misfortune to work with developers, you'll know that for many of them, thinking about costs at all, and especially being asked to think about them in a Sprint Zero context or whatever, is not necessarily good for their productivity. A lot of them, personality-wise, it'll stress them out. They'll be like, I don't want to think about this. I'm just trying to think about the best way to do this, right? I don't know what this is going to cost or whatever. So, like, all of that said, you may
so what I'm hearing,
yeah.
What I'm hearing, to chime in there, Dave, and just correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing there is it's too late by Sprint Zero. A lot of the stuff should have been done beforehand. Not in every instance, but if you're only really trying to get to it in Sprint Zero, it's probably too late. Ideally we would have liked a lot of this to have happened before Sprint Zero.
Well, yeah, like enough of the estimation, because it's you make a good point, because clearly at this point, does it matter? You're already doing Sprint Zero. You're engaged. So yes, it's good to refine your estimate.
Yeah, and there's a contract signed, whether it's with an outsourced partner or with a team. You're in it. You're doing it. You're going.
You got to what you needed to get to know if you wanted to pull the trigger before this, right? I will say, to our earlier point, built into Agile, and also because of the nature of software, after a few sprints, assuming you're properly tracking statistics around your stories and everything, you will be getting a better and better idea of what your estimate for the rest of the project's looking like. So Sprint Zero isn't, I guess, unique in that regard. Every sprint, especially the first few, will be refining your estimate of what the project will look like to completion.
Awesome. Dave, I think that's about all we got time for today. Are there any closing thoughts that you want to give to any particularly non-technical people listening to this podcast? This episode really is aimed at the kind of non-developer person wondering why the hell it's so bloody difficult to estimate times and costs. Any closing thoughts, any final pieces of advice, any koans that you want to leave them with before we close up?
Sure. I would just, I suppose I'd repeat, uncertainty increases over time. So really, really, really try to prioritize what you actually need up front and see how specific you can get about that. It can potentially, especially for a startup, it can seem quite crazy to spend money to investigate and plan a better estimate up front, but it may well be worth it for you, depending how much you have on the line, right? To spend that money on some initial investigation and prototyping and stuff to actually know what you're on the hook for might be quite a good approach that I think a lot of people the first time around just don't even consider, because they're just like, I already have so little money, how could I spend any of it up front, right? But again, in a way, that's buying insurance. You can mitigate some of your uncertainty up front, and you should consider whether it's worth it to you. One other thing I'll say that hasn't been mentioned is I think often where you can get a wide disparity in estimates, especially with people from less experience, is like, are you estimating what it will take to be like, it's live, or are you estimating what it'll take for it to actually be done? You'll very commonly see what I refer to as the mythical 3 months, where someone will say, well, X didn't happen in 3 months. Whenever you look into that, you will almost most of the time find out that what hit the ground in 3 months was very buggy and actually missing major features. And I think often people blur that in their thinking because it sucks. It sucks to think about how long stuff actually takes. And they take the time to they conflate the time to an initial buggy prototype to the time to a polished product that you would actually put in front of a VC or a client of yours without squirming as they use it, right? And it's
right, and
particularly
in fintech, right, where products are not safe to fail. So it's particularly relevant in our space.
Exactly, and it's very often, I think, underestimated how long it takes to potentially go from like, cool, we've got MVP first version running, to like, okay, I would bet my life on this, right? On this working can be quite a long distance that I think people tend to gloss over when they estimate.
Yeah, and it's just maybe a closing analogy that most people can relate to is, a very recent example. We've just rebuilt or built a new house for my parents, and I was just blown away at how quickly the walls went up. I was blown away at how fast the walls and the roof went on, right? And then I was equally blown away at how goddamn long it took to get the finishing in. It was just like, oh my God, is this ever going to finish, to actually complete the house? And it's a great analogy, right? To get the walls and the roof on, you have a house. You do have a house. Objectively, it's a house. To finish it,
yeah, totally,
so that somebody can actually live in it and be comfortable, was 4 times longer than the build of quote unquote the house. And anyone who's built a house knows what I'm talking about. They go up very quickly, but to actually finish them and get them livable, very different. Very simple analogy, but I think it's quite a good analogy to building software.
Yeah, I think it's great. And the 20th time you stub your toe on the one step that's actually was done at a weird height, but everyone didn't want to fix it at the time, will become steadily more annoying, I think, to perhaps
totally
the analogy.
Totally. And it's one of the reasons to the listeners why we ask people as one of the first questions. If you get hold of me and ask me to work with us, one of the first things I'm going to ask you is, have you built a software project before? Because if you haven't done it, it's almost impossible to know what you're in for. Dave, always great to have you on the show. I don't really consider you a guest, so I'm not going to be all nice to you. I'm just going to say thanks for dropping in. I see enough of you already. You're not that special. But it was super interesting. As always, I think I come into these things knowing a lot. Then I listen to you speak and I just realize, there's a lot I didn't know and I learned a lot. So thanks a lot. I think my main takeaway today was that line that you said around, in the real world example with a power plant or a bridge or a fighter jet, you can have a perfect blueprint and build it. But in software, it's this weird, unique situation where the blueprint is the finished product. In other words, a blueprint is largely not possible. So thanks for coming on. Thanks for making the time, Dave.
Cool. Yeah. Always a pleasure, Mike. Thank you.
To the listeners, thanks for listening to the show. I hope you got some value today. If you would like to discuss your fintech project with a team of experts, you're invited to book a call with one of our principals. You'll find us on our website, www.nona.digital. And I'll be back next week with another episode to explore the Fintech Founder Journey.